Hi everyone, this is Kevin here, and I want to share with you a video that will help to set up a discussion topic for our next Argument Ninja Dojo video meeting. If you're watching this and you're not already a member, these meetings are part of what you get access to when you sign up with membership at argumentninja.com. This video will introduce a topic and raise some questions that we can discuss in the follow-up meeting. And just so you know, members of the Argument Ninja Dojo get access to the archived video recordings of all of these discussions. So if you find the issues raised in this video interesting and you want to join in, please consider becoming a member over at argumentninja.com. Okay, this topic was inspired by a recent essay that Peter Boghossian published in November called Welcome to Culture War 2.0, The Great Realignment. Peter is a professor of philosophy at Portland State University. He's well known as a proponent of atheism and scientific skepticism, and he's a leader in the so-called street epistemology movement, which is an effort to engage in one-on-one conversations with people about philosophical and religious topics. He's also somewhat notorious for his role with two other colleagues in writing and getting published a set of hoax papers in academic journals as part of an effort to demonstrate what they regard as problems with scholarship within a set of fields in the humanities and the social sciences that are dominated by an ideology that he believes is deeply problematic and having a negative impact on culture. So this article is an attempt to distill some of the key features of this problematic ideology, which he associates with a postmodern, critical theory, social justice, political philosophy, and mindset. And here he wants to contrast that with a different philosophical tradition and a different approach to discourse and social persuasion that he associates with a more traditional Enlightenment approach to reason and evidence and communication. The idea is that this new postmodern, post-Enlightenment philosophy is the driver of a new culture war that is, somewhat ironically, creating alliances between groups that have historically seen themselves as opponents in, at least in American political history. So, for example, if the issue was same-sex marriage, that's how the different sides of the debate would have traditionally lined up. Peter argues that Culture War 1.0 has largely been won by the secular/liberal values side, which makes him happy because that's his side. But today, there's a different culture war being fought along different lines. What are these lines? Well, the article is partly about trying to describe the divisions, but for sake of simplicity, it's probably not too far off to say that this is a war between, as he sees it, post-Enlightenment or postmodern values and principles and more traditional Enlightenment values and principles. Now, what does this mean? In the article, he looks at three different categories or three different fault lines that have to do with attitudes towards truth and the role of reason and evidence in grounding knowledge claims, attitudes towards speech and what kinds of speech are socially permissible, and attitudes toward, for lack of a better term, identity. How identity politics has become intermingled with a new metaphysics and epistemology that is tightly coupled to identity claims. In the essay, Peter uses these labels to elaborate on each of these points. So these cultural fault lines, he argues, have to do with, one, differences in attitude toward what he calls the correspondence theory of truth. Number two, differences in what he calls the rules of engagement. These are the rules of acceptable public discourse. And number three, differences in attitudes toward identity, and specifically the concept of identity that is tied up with the concept of intersectionality. One of his theses is that debates over these issues are making allies out of former ideological enemies. Boghossian, the militant liberal atheist, is finding himself on the same side of these issues as many religious conservatives, and ostracized by progressive social justice liberals in academia and in the broader culture. And, you can never accuse these guys of understating their concern. What's at stake here, he claims, is no less than the future of Western civilization. So that's my quick intro. Go read the article. It's not very long. There's a lot that we could talk about. But here for this video, I want to just spend some time talking about one part of this thesis. The part where Boghossian talks about what he calls the correspondence theory of truth. This paragraph is straight from the paper. The correspondence theory of truth basically states that objective truth exists, and we can know something about it through evidence and reason. That is, there are objective truths to be known, and we gain reliable knowledge about them when our beliefs align with reality. It's termed the correspondence theory of truth because a statement is considered true when it corresponds with reality and false when it does not. My plan is to put some critical pressure on how he frames this particular fault line. I'm going to recommend another way of framing it. So what does this say? Well, let me walk you through a cartoon version of this. This person here is making a claim, is asserting something. And let's say they're asserting something about the world. Could be anything. Tigers live in Asia. Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system. The cat is on the mat. So this first part of the story is a commitment to belief in an external world. There is a world out there, external to us, external to our minds and concepts and our categories and our perceptions. And this world has a certain structure. This is a metaphysical thesis, a belief in the objective reality of an external world. Now, to be a little bit technical, we want to say that the words and sentences we use when we make assertions actually refer to objects or entities or states of affairs in the world. So when I'm talking about the planet Jupiter, and make assertions about Jupiter, I'm referring to and describing entities that exist or might exist in the external world. But we want to say more about this relationship between words and the world. We want to be able to say that my assertions about the world can be true or false. So when I say that Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, I want to say that that assertion can be true or false. Now, what makes that statement true or false? Well, the obvious answer is that if the statement is true, it's true because it asserts something that corresponds to the facts in the world. It's true just in case Jupiter is, in fact, the largest planet in our solar system. So what I've just described here is an articulation of what is traditionally known in philosophy as a correspondence view of the nature of truth. Truth is a relation that stands between a linguistic, symbolic entity of some kind and the facts of the matter or the states of affairs in the world itself. So the assertion is true just in case it corresponds to the world. It's false otherwise. When I say the cat is sleeping on the mat, that's true just in case the cat is, in fact, sleeping on the mat. What I want to say about this is that this is fundamentally a semantic thesis. It's a view about what it means for a claim to be true or false. But we'll get back to this because we're not finished yet. An essential part of the view that Peter Boghossian describes in that passage is that we can have knowledge of this external world. The direct quote is that objective truth exists and we can know something about it through evidence and reason. There are objective truths to be known and we can gain reliable knowledge of them, unquote. Now, this is a separate claim, it's a separate thesis. It is entirely possible, for example, that an objective world could exist and our language could make claims about that world. It could refer to that world, but we don't actually know if those claims are true or false. We may not have any knowledge of this world at all. So this part is a separate thesis. It's an epistemological thesis. It's a thesis about knowledge. So when you put all of this together, you have first a metaphysical thesis about the existence of the external world that has some intrinsic structure. There is a world that exists outside of our perceptions, our beliefs, our social categories, our language, our conscious minds, and so on. And second, we have a semantic thesis about the way that language hooks up to the world. It's about what it means to say that our assertions are about this external world. And this thesis states that the meaning of our assertions is determined in part by reference to states of affairs in this external world. In other words, if I'm talking about Jupiter, I'm making a claim about an objectively existing entity. I'm not talking about a belief or an idea or a concept. I'm talking about Jupiter. And then we have a third thesis, an epistemological thesis about our knowledge of the world. We're saying that sometimes, at least, we can be justified in believing that what we're saying about the external world is actually true or approximately true. We're justified in believing that there's some degree of correspondence between what we say about the world and the facts of the matter as they actually obtain in the world. So, what I've just described here are the components of what philosophers have traditionally described as the doctrine of philosophical realism about a specific domain. And traditionally, only this part, the semantic part, is identified with a correspondence theory of truth. Because think about it. What is a theory of truth? It's a theory about what it means for something to be true or false and what the truth relation consists in. Truth as correspondence is one way of answering these questions. Now, depending on how you define things, there are versions of the correspondence theory of truth that include a commitment to the metaphysical thesis, a belief in an objectively existing external reality. So that would include the metaphysical thesis as a component, part of that, joined up with that semantic thesis. But I, and many philosophers, think it's useful to distinguish the metaphysical part from the semantic part so we can talk about alternative views that modify or reject different parts of this picture. What's clear to everyone, though, is that the epistemological thesis is a separate claim entirely. Now, to repeat, what I'm describing here is what most philosophers would call philosophical realism, or what it means to hold a realist view about a particular domain. So one can be a realist about science, a realist about ethics, about mathematics, about religion, and so on. Basically, to be a realist about some domain is to assert that there is some formulation of each of these three theses that is true within that domain. But then it's easy to see what it would take to be an anti-realist about any of these domains. To be an anti-realist is to assert that at least one of these theses is false for that given domain. So you could deny the metaphysical thesis, you could deny the independent metaphysical reality of the entities that we're describing, or you could deny the semantic thesis. You could say that our language actually doesn't refer to these entities. Or you could deny the epistemological thesis. You could deny that we actually have knowledge of such entities. So thinking just in terms of logical combinations, there are a lot more ways to be an anti-realist than to be a realist. Any one of these combinations in the bottom here is a possible anti-realist view. This helps to explain why there are, in fact, many different varieties of realism and anti-realism. The intellectual landscape actually looks more like this. Within each domain, and there are others, we're just picking these four because they're so prominent in these discussions. You've got a realist tradition and an anti-realist tradition, and within them, you've got different varieties of each. I think it's helpful to have a few more concrete examples, so here's an example from science. To be a scientific realist about the claims of particle physics, for example, is to believe that 1, there is an objectively existing external world, and 2, our theories about subatomic particles and processes make claims about this external world. So, for example, when we say that neutrinos are subatomic particles that are created in nuclear reactions, we say that they have a half-integer spin, that they only interact with the weak force and gravity, that they're electrically neutral, and they have a very small but finite mass. We want to say these assertions can be interpreted as making claims about the existence and the characteristics of objectively existing entities in the external world and the laws that govern them. This is how the semantic thesis connects to the metaphysical thesis via a correspondence theory of truth. And then finally, number 3, we are sometimes justified in believing that our theories about the subatomic realm are at least approximately true. So the way to be an anti-realist about particle physics is to challenge one or more of these 3 theses. Now, a common form of anti-realism in science is some form of empiricism, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now, what does this look like in the case of ethics? Well, if you're a realist about ethics, or what philosophers call a moral realist, then you believe, for example, that when someone tells their kid that stealing is wrong, this moral claim, stealing is wrong, is the sort of thing that can be true or false, and that what makes it true or false is its correspondence to some moral facts of the matter or moral states of affairs in the world, broadly construed. Now, it's not so obvious what these facts of the matter or states of affairs could be that could play this role of grounding the truth or falsity of the moral claims that we make. There are lots of candidates. Utilitarians, for example, will talk about states of happiness and unhappiness as the class of morally relevant facts. If you're a natural rights theorist, though, you'll probably talk about the possession of certain morally relevant properties of agents, like personhood. Or if you're a divine right theorist, you'll probably talk about conformity to the will of God, and so on. And the final point, again, is that moral realism is usually committed to some form of an epistemological claim as well, that we're sometimes justified in believing that we've got our moral claims right. So an anti-realist about ethics could deny any one of these claims. They could deny that moral claims are the sort of thing that could even be true or false. They could deny that we could ever know whether a moral claim is true or false. Or they could deny that there are any such things as objective moral values or moral properties. And there are, in fact, many, many varieties of such views in circulation. Now, an important and very interesting class of claims for someone like Boghossian are religious claims. Beliefs in supernatural beings that exist outside or beyond the natural world, beliefs in supernatural interventions in the natural order, beliefs in the moral or spiritual status of human beings, beliefs in what we can expect to experience after we die, beliefs in social relations that God approves of or disapproves of, and so on. There is a long history of debate over how exactly to interpret religious language, the writings of religious texts, but to be a realist about religious belief or religious language, like God created human beings in his own image, or Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, or the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ during the Catholic Mass, you got to believe these things. You got to believe, one, that the entities described in these assertions have a real independent existence. There is a God, there is a Jesus, and so on. Two, that these assertions, that your language is making claims about these entities that are true just in case they correspond to the facts about these entities. And three, that we're sometimes justified in believing that these claims are true. So you could describe this as a literal or common sense reading of religious language. So it follows, again, that there are a lot of ways that you can be an anti-realist about religion. You can be a flat-out metaphysical naturalist and deny the existence of supernatural entities that could intervene in human affairs. You could be an epistemological skeptic and deny that we ever have any good reasons to believe the claims that religions make. Or you could have a different view of the meaning of religious language. You might argue, for example, that religious language isn't supposed to be interpreted literally. It's metaphorical, it's symbolic, it's expressive. Maybe it conveys important truths the way that poetry and other forms of fiction can express important truths. Or you could argue that religious belief or religious practices serve some important social function, but again, without being interpreted literally. At any rate, all of this is just to give you a sense of what it means to be a realist or an anti-realist in these different areas. Now, let's get back to Peter Boghossian's Culture War article. And I hope it's clear by now why his description of what he calls the correspondence theory of truth is potentially misleading or confusing. It risks confusion to label this whole package of beliefs the correspondence theory of truth, because only part of it is. The whole package is closer to what we've called taking a realist approach to science and to rational inquiry. Now, maybe that's not such a big deal in the broader scope of Boghossian's argument. Maybe we can just swap this out. So if we just replace correspondence theory of truth with philosophical realism in passages like this one, that seems to read okay. Let's try that. In Culture War 1.0, philosophical realism was a given on all sides. In 2014, even as Culture War 1.0 was ending, Bill Nye, the science guy, debated Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis over the age of the Earth, with Nye arguing the evidence demonstrated Earth was considerably older than Ham claimed. Despite their differences, both believed there was a truth out there and that we could know it through science and reason, and in Ham's case, faith in Scripture. So this all sounds about right. But this is just to say that they both adopt a realist attitude toward the domain that they're discussing. And the postmodern critical theory types that Boghossian views as on the other side of Culture War 2.0 will still be critical of this view, regardless of what you call it. They'll go after realism for the same reasons they'll go after what he calls the correspondence theory of truth. So maybe in this sense, we can just swap it out. But now I want to turn to the important claim that Boghossian actually makes. He thinks there's something very important about this view, which I've now reframed as philosophical realism. The article emphasizes that this is an important fault line in Culture War 2.0. He believes that the fate of Western culture is at stake, potentially. So why is it so important? Why does it need to be defended? Well, I think it's clear that it's not the philosophical stance per se that is important here. My reading of Boghossian and other defenders of Enlightenment values and principles is that what's important to modern culture and the future of modern culture is the social structure that enables a certain kind of critical social knowledge, of which scientific knowledge is just one form, to continue to progress. We want our knowledge to improve. We want our theories to become more predictive, more explanatory, more effective at answering our pressing questions and meeting the challenges of modern life. We need this knowledge to make wise decisions that will ensure our survival and promote our collective welfare. I'm going to say that Boghossian's real worry, and the real worry of his ideological colleagues in this discussion, is that post-Enlightenment critical theory, driven by a social justice agenda, will promote junk science, and it'll shut down legitimate and potentially important science because the conclusions of that science may not support a particular social justice agenda. So if that's right, then let me rephrase the question that I'm actually concerned with. If our goal is to protect and nurture a certain cultural tradition of critical inquiry and a certain conception of the authority of science, do we need to defend philosophical realism as I've sketched it here? Do we need to defend this whole package of philosophical beliefs? And the answer, I'm going to argue, is no, we don't. Or at least not all of it, and not all of the time. The spirit of critical inquiry and the methods that we use to pursue critical inquiry don't presuppose in any strong way a realist conception of science and scientific knowledge. Enlightenment values and principles don't presuppose this. They are compatible with realism, but they don't require realism. You can be an anti-realist about science and still be a fierce defender of scientific methodology and scientific rationality. Now, how is this possible? The obvious historical example is to look at the tradition of empiricism in the philosophy of science. The basic empiricist view looks something like this. We start with our scientist who makes a claim about the world, but the world for the empiricist has two dimensions that really need to be distinguished. There's the part of the world that we can experience, the part that we can observe and perceive and measure. This is the realm of observable phenomena. This is the part that constitutes the empirical phenomena that are actually what scientists deal with directly. Then we can distinguish the world that lies beyond the observable realm, beyond the world of appearances, beyond the world of empirical phenomena. This is the world that we don't interact with directly, and that we can only theorize about. Now, different kinds of empiricists use different criteria for how to draw this line, to demarcate between the observable world and the unobservable world, but they all draw it somewhere. Now, what's really important and distinctive about the empiricist conception of science is the belief that the proper goal of science is to deepen and systematize our understanding of the observable realm, the realm of empirical phenomena, to describe, explain, and predict measurable phenomena. That's the proper goal of science. It's not, as the scientific realist would say, to uncover the true hidden natures of things, the reality behind the appearances. We can construct theories about the true hidden natures of the world, but the empiricist attitude toward theories about the unobservable parts of the world is that we should adopt a skeptical attitude toward such theories. In general, we can't know how close to the truth they are. For the empiricist, theories are valuable to the scientist to the degree to which they help us to understand and predict observable phenomena. And for some empiricists, it's not even meaningful to talk about a world beyond the world of measurable phenomena. Now, if that strikes you as a kind of anti-scientific view, there is maybe some irony in the fact that various kinds of empiricist anti-realism were very popular among scientists and philosophers of science in the first half of the 20th century. And this modern empiricist tradition grew out of a much longer tradition of empiricist thinking within science that extends through the whole modern period to the beginnings of the scientific revolution. So, even though this is a form of anti-realism about science, the people who defended it were fiercely pro-science. And this is just one variety of anti-realism about science, where the defenders were also very strongly pro-science. There are other varieties. Thomas Kuhn, for example, famous author of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was an anti-realist of a different stripe, but still very much an advocate for science. And there are forms of pragmatism in the philosophy of science that are anti-realist, but still not anti-science. So the upshot here is that there have always been realist and anti-realist traditions within science and among philosophers of science. It's one of those long-standing debates that scientists continue to have within their own fields. For example, here's a famous picture from 1927. Einstein and Planck are there in the front row, both of whom have realist sympathies in the philosophy of science. Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg are in the middle row and the back rows, both of whom had pretty strong anti-realist sympathies. So, anti-realism doesn't require skepticism about science or a lack of critical scientific rationality. So, what's my point? Let's bring this back around to Peter Boghossian's thesis. He wants to say that a commitment to the correspondence theory of truth, or what I've argued is better described as philosophical realism, is an important fault line for Culture War 2.0. Why? Because he thinks it's central to the Enlightenment tradition of critical inquiry in science and critical reasoning more broadly. But I don't think this is right. You can be committed to critical inquiry in science and critical thinking in general, of the kind that Boghossian admires, without being committed to a realist philosophy of science. So the crux of the issue isn't the correspondence theory of truth or philosophical realism. The crux has to do with the real worries that people like Boghossian have about the impact that progressive postmodern philosophies of science, a certain type of anti-realism about science, will have on the quality of the knowledge that is generated by science. But it's not a rejection of realism as such that threatens the quality of knowledge production. What threatens it is a rejection of a certain conception of how science should be practiced. So, what is this conception? What is required to generate this kind of knowledge? Well, this isn't an easy question, but it is a lot easier than resolving the realism-anti-realism debate. Here's how I prefer to think about these issues. And I think most practicing scientists think about these issues. The key to understanding scientific methodology is that the collection of methods and protocols that fall under this label that we've developed over the past 200 or so years, these are all strategies that we have designed to reduce or mitigate the errors that human beings are prone to make. Because the reality is that left to our own devices, human beings are really quite terrible scientists. We are prone to confirmation bias. We're persuaded too easily by anecdotal evidence. We don't weigh evidence properly. We see patterns where there aren't any, and we attribute causal meaning to patterns that are often meaningless. And the list goes on and on. That's why we developed statistical techniques for analyzing data and for testing hypotheses. That's why we developed the methodology of blind, randomized, controlled studies. That's why we worry about sample size and replicability. That's why we publish in peer-reviewed journals. It's because we really suck at this. But there is another important part of the story. Another key factor that is central to successful science has to do with a certain set of intellectual virtues. These are habits and dispositions and values that improve the quality of our reasoning and the knowledge we produce, like intellectual curiosity, open-mindedness, honesty, humility, and so on. So we have strategies for reducing errors, and we have intellectual virtues. These are central to scientific reasoning and the critical spirit. Now, obviously, I'm not saying anything earth-shattering here. I'm just saying that if we're interested in preserving what's really important about the Enlightenment tradition of reasoning critically about the world, this is where the focus of our attention should be. These are the norms and the practices and the social structures that we need to defend and protect. And notice that none of this requires a commitment to any particular realist philosophy of science, any particular view about the nature of reality, or the limits of scientific knowledge. You can be a die-hard anti-realist about science and still support all of this. So, time to wrap up. The upshot of this whole discussion is really just to make a suggestion for how to talk about this first component of Peter's thesis about a new kind of culture war. The component that talks about truth and knowledge and objective facts. I haven't said anything explicitly about free speech or the rules of engagement, as he calls it, and I haven't said anything about identity politics or the philosophy of identity. My suggestion was that what's really important here has to do with a certain conception of how we should practice science, and more broadly, how to think critically about the world. Now, if this is really under attack, then I'm on board with the call to defend it. Now, I also appreciate that any defense of critical thinking and scientific reasoning is going to have implications for the speech issue. On its face, we don't want to incentivize norms and a culture that censors the kind of speech that is essential to the social structures that actually implement this conception of critical thinking and scientific reasoning. But it is a separate question just how concerned we should be about freedom of speech in the sciences and in academia. Now, I know that Boghossian and others who identify with this culture war narrative have very strong feelings about this, but I take that as a separate question that needs a separate analysis because it raises a whole different set of social and political issues. So that's it. Like I said at the top, this whole video is actually for the benefit of members of my Argument Ninja Dojo community. I'm sharing this in advance of a video meeting that we're going to have on Zoom in a couple of days. We're going to talk about the article. This was, in fact, just a prompt for a discussion in a certain area that I happen to have something to say about. If you're interested in participating in these kinds of discussions, please visit our site at argumentninja.com. You can learn more about how to join up and get access to a whole bunch of community resources, including these Zoom meetings. So, until next time, thanks for watching.